This is Public Sector Voices with Emily Rogers. Today we're joined by the Director of the National Innovation Centre for Data, Steve Caughey. Steve has worked as a software engineer and a systems architect, as well as CEO of a startup which was sold to Hewlett-Packard. He now leads the centre, working to unite industry, the public sector and academics to develop the skills, ideas and resources needed to exploit the opportunities offered by the explosion in digital data. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve. Can you tell us a little bit about the centre and a bit of its history as well?
Sure. So the centre, the National Innovation Centre for Data, is here because lots of organizations are having problems with gathering and collecting all this data and finding that even though they're collecting it and storing it effectively, they're actually not utilizing it. They're only scratching the surface. So lots of chief execs are telling me that they're drowning in data. So they know that inside all of that data, there's information that would be useful to their organization, but they just can't get their hands on it. So National Innovation Centre for Data was set up to help organizations to get the skills that they need in order to extract value from data. And we're funded £15 million funding from central government, matched by 15 million from Newcastle University.
Oh, and how long has it been open?
So when we received the funding about approximately 2 years ago, we've had our core staff in place for about a year, and our wonderful shiny new building, which called the Catalyst on Newcastle, which is already winning lots of awards, only opened in December, and then we were obviously asked to leave again in March, which is a great shame.
Yeah, and what does like a normal day look like for you then?
So we have to work with lots of businesses and public sector organizations. So there's a huge amount of variety in what we do. So at any one time, we'll be running maybe half a dozen projects simultaneously. So I'll be talking to the staff about what they're doing in those projects, maybe sitting in on initial meetings that they're doing with those projects. But a lot of my day is spent drumming up new business. So going out and talking in events or face-to-face with other organizations about the problems they face, and then helping to set up collaborative skills projects, which is the primary thing that we do to assist them.
And I know one of the aims of the centre is, like you said, to address the shortage of data skills in the UK. How far away are we from where we need to be in that regard?
Some considerable way. So the demand for workers with sort of specialist data skills has tripled in just the last 5 years, and there's no sign of that reducing. So the amount of skills that are required by organizations is absolutely immense, and universities and higher education just haven't been able to keep pace. So these people are like hen's teeth. And the few that are produced tend to be gobbled up by big finance houses and global vendors. So for many organizations, trying to get these data skills in that would help them get insight from their data is a real struggle. So just under O'Reilly Media estimate that just under half of Europe's organizations are currently struggling to fill those sort of data analytics roles in the organizations. So we're a long way from being able to satisfy the demand.
Let's say, for example, for argument's sake, that I know nothing about data and the kind of difference it can make.
Sure.
How can properly giving people those skills, what impact could it have on like the potential of the country?
So there's probably two ways to measure that, I guess. One is looking at what the estimated economic benefit is for the country, and there's been lots of reports on this. PwC did one just a year or two ago on the economic impact of artificial intelligence, and they've estimated that GDP would be more than 10% higher in 2030 as a result of people investing in this area. That's 332 billion. I've got the number here. So that's a huge potential for the entire country. But the other way to look at it is from an individual organization's point of view. So there are plenty of individual organizations who know that if they could get into that data and make sense of it, they could make efficiency savings, operational improvements, but probably more importantly, they could get a better understanding of their clients and their customers. And through that, improve the services, innovate around new products and services. So the potential for individual organizations is immense. And I hear people tell me that on a daily basis.
And is the geography of the centre important? Like why Newcastle?
So it's important in the sense there's probably two reasons why it's important. One is that it's not London, and that's
Hmm.
important because the market for people with these skills in London is incredibly hot, and people are leaving jobs with on average within a year in data science. So getting and retaining staff in somewhere like London would be almost impossible. The reason why it's in Newcastle is that Newcastle's good at this stuff. So as a university, we're world leading in scalable data science. We are leading in teaching in that we have fantastic PhD program, master's program, undergraduates. So it's the right place in terms of a talent pipeline, but it's also the right
Hmm.
place in the sense that data scientists don't need to be based in the middle of the city somewhere. Now they can be based somewhere where the standard of living is so much better that can help us to retain people and enjoy working in an environment that excites and interests them. So Newcastle is a great location for that.
And why is it that people tend to leave these kind of roles within a year?
Because they're poached. The demand for people with these skills is just so high, particularly
Mm,
people who have got some level of experience. And if you're in an environment where you're working in this space and you're going out to networking events in the evening and meeting people all day, they're going to be chasing you. So there's a lot of churn in London and in the southeast and in the US. It's much better in the northeast and presumably in the northwest as well. And the salaries these people can make now is really impressive. They're one of the best paid sets of people coming out of universities, and if you have a few years of experience, you can earn vast sums of money. So in the UK, in the US, the national average for a data scientist is 120K, and that's for people coming out with
wow.
undergraduate level, master's level, with a year or two of experience.
Wow. And obviously, I know that you'll be making some real kind of differences to a lot of businesses and a lot of organizations, but could you give us any examples of the way that data's kind of transformed an organization that we can kind of understand in real terms?
Yeah, sure. So we do a lot of work with both public sector and private sector, but I'll give you a private sector example. So we are working with AkzoNobel, who own Crown
Hmm.
Paints and lots of other paint organizations, and in Newcastle they work on coatings for ships. And it turns out that coatings on
Right.
ships are very important because they prevent the buildup of barnacles and things. And even a small number of barnacles on a huge ship can cost hundreds of thousands in operations. And so they're interested in coating ships, but they're much more interested now in moving away from selling buckets of paint to supplying a service. So offering the
Right.
service that keeps the ship barnacle free rather than doing individual sales. And lots of businesses are moving in this way. They're moving towards being service businesses. And so AXO approached us about 2 years ago now, wanting to begin to make this move. And they appreciated that in order to do that effectively, they would have to monitor all of these ships, monitor the sensors and the cameras that were checking these ships, crunch through that data, and identify which ships needed recoating in order to maintain this service level. So we worked with them to help build data analytics capability. So we didn't solve the problem for them. We helped them to solve the problem for themselves. So they're now building an entire
Mm.
team in ExxonMobil who are working on these sort of problems and helping generate new products and services for the business.
So is this kind of, does it go into the realms of like smart cities and things being able to do things autonomously, like they talk about, bins that tell you when they're empty or trees that water themselves, things like that? Does that come into it?
It does absolutely. So the concept of smart cities is built on the idea that you can take data from multiple sources and make sense of what's happening within an environmental context. Yeah. So it's no longer sufficient just to, let's say, take data from the bin lorry, right? But being able to add that data about weather and about pollution or about schools and traffic and the bins themselves and lighting and so on means that you can create much more efficient environments for those sort of services. And that's bins is obviously just one example, but there are literally thousands of examples where mixing data gives you so much information and lets you think about problems in completely new ways.
So I guess that leads us on to the public sector then. Is there any examples that you've worked with on the public sector?
Sure, we've done quite a lot of work with the public sector. It does tend to be a little bit tougher working with the public sector, and we can maybe come on to that later. But we have worked, for example, with the Business Services Authority, who are part of the NHS, helping them understand pharmacy data, trying to understand when people are making returns around subscriptions as to whether that's being effective or not, or whether even people are making mistakes in the submissions, or ultimately even potentially fraudulent claims as well. That's one example.
Okay.
But there are many other examples. We're also working, for example, with Newcastle upon Tyne Health Hospitals Trust, working in conjunction with social care to explore whether we could rationalize services across the social care healthcare boundary. Working with the Northeast Ambulance Service to help them manage their ambulance fleet and the sending out of ambulances to particular incidents. Other examples have been working with the Vulnerable Families Program to try to better understand the various data sources that could be used to help better understand families that are in a difficult position. So there's a whole variety of potential data related problems. In fact, ultimately, almost every problem is data related in one form or another.
Wow. And obviously, one of the big problems that the public sector is facing at the moment is the climate crisis. Is there any potential for data to really impact this?
Yeah, certainly. So we're working with some voluntary sector organisations in the Northeast to try to gather data in order to help us better understand the sort of natural capital that we have, and the economic capital, the social capital, in order to help them to identify interventions that would help within climate change while still maintaining social value and economic value and so on. So we're doing that. We're also working very closely with a group at Newcastle University called the Urban Observatory, who have a fantastic collection of urban-related data. And we're helping to provide the skills that let people explore that data to see whether interventions around controlling traffic and reducing pollution, improving energy usage. With a recent project, somebody was talking to us about monitoring the city to identify which roofs within the city would be suitable for solar panels. And that requires a huge amount of data computation in order to identify the slopes of roofs and what the weather is going to be like at various times and so on. So that's another example.
Amazing. And also another challenge that we're facing is the huge health challenge that we're facing now. How much do you work with health data, and can you tell us about any things that you're working on in health?
Sure. So we've done a few projects just recently, sort of pro bono projects actually, helping out with the local authority and the health organisations in the region. So just a couple of examples there. One, we worked with Newcastle upon Tyne Health Trust to help them work out how to prioritize patients at the peak of. Luckily, we were never overwhelmed in the Northeast in terms of hospital beds and so on. But we worked with them to help understand how they could prioritize patients. We've worked with a hospital in Italy, which was at the center of the COVID crisis in the early days, helping them to do something similar, prioritize, understand health conditions that were early indicators of deterioration in patients' health. We've also been working with Northeast Ambulance Service to help them again prioritize. Although luckily, again, that project hasn't had to go too far because things have been very stable here in the Northeast. So there's lots of examples where we've jumped in to assist, and the fact that you had a group of data analysts who could turn on a dime to help engage on these projects was really very valuable, and sort of illustrates to public sector organizations how important that resource is in a crisis. If you can't understand what's happening within the crisis, then there's no way you can respond effectively to it.
Yeah, and it's definitely the way the world is going, with all things becoming more like focused on data. But I suppose with all of that sensitive data and information, especially around people's health, how do you tackle or mitigate against things like cybersecurity and attacks like that?
So cybersecurity isn't an area that we look at in particular, but what we do
Hmm.
is we look at for opportunities where data can provide value. So one of the problems that we often come across is that, understandably, for legal reasons, organizations have put in place pretty firm governance that protects data. But one of the problems that we find
Hmm.
is that there's often nobody else in the organization whose job it is to exploit data and find ways of making use of it. So if all the emphasis is on protecting the data and keeping it safe, then the way you keep data safe is you wrap it up in a safe and don't let anybody near it. And that tends to be
Yeah.
the default situation. So I think organizations need to think about whether they want to create roles like chief data officer or something, who's responsible for sweating this really valuable asset that, for example, in the health sector could save lives on a regular basis if we could get the data and share it safely and securely.
And how, again, let's assume that I don't know anything about this. How do you collect that kind of data?
So most data in the health field is still being collected through paper processes, but
Hmm.
increasingly people are wearing sensors. There are sensors in devices at the bedside, in vehicles. There is data coming in through social media, which can have real value as well. So there's a whole set of sources of data, of automated data, which means that you can automate the process of collecting it and analyzing it, and that's becoming much more frequent, particularly in the health field. People are using more wearables. They're wearing Fitbits and smart watches, and increasingly they'll be using their phones to help take, I don't know, temperature and measure how much you're moving and your overall health. And pulling all of that data together along with your existing health records could provide immense benefits for the individual and for society.
Yeah, it seems that the public sector and all of those kind of public services stand to benefit a lot from the use of data. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you engage with the public sector and what that relationship is kind of like?
Yeah, so that sort of takes me back to the comment I made earlier about how sometimes engaging with the public sector is quite difficult. So, dealing with the private sector, there's the profit motive. So, it means
Hmm.
that whenever we identify some opportunity, they can simply make a measure of how much benefit it's going to provide them. And when they present that to their stakeholders, it becomes a no brainer if there's enough value in it. Of course, in the public sector, of course, there's political considerations, but also there's budget constraints. And so, even if something
Yeah.
strategically makes a lot of sense, it's very hard to get the funding to carry out a large project. So, when we deal with the public sector, we generally try to persuade them that the way to approach building data analytics capability is to start small, to identify some low hanging fruit, a particular problem that you think is amenable to being solved by data, and invest in a small project. Because that way you can build up the skills internally inside the organization. You can solve a problem and then bring it to the attention of management. And then people see that investing in this space provides value and they can incrementally grow that capacity. Yeah. The problem sometimes in the public sector is that because people don't really understand this area, they're likely to go out and talk to a consultant or to a platform vendor and then spend a large amount of money on equipment and technology before they even understand
Yeah.
what their technology needs are. So we argue that starting small and building is the way to approach this situation.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention about people not really understanding because I was going to ask about, obviously you're part funded by the university. How much do you do in terms of education and trying to get young people involved in this kind of thing and making sure that people do know like the benefits that can come from
Yeah.
data?
So we do three things at the National Innovation Centre for Data. One of which is we run these collaborative projects, which I've been talking about. The second is that we sort of map
Hmm.
out the ecosystem so we can help organizations understand who out there might assist them. But the third thing what we do is we support by running lots of events. And when those events are aimed at
Mm.
management teams, sector specialists, technical specialists, but also increasingly at students and school kids, because we want to really excite people about the potential of data in their lives. Yeah. And it's not something aimed at the digital community. It's aimed at everybody. I mean, everybody over the last couple of months has begun to start looking at charts and understanding and analyzing statistics. And so there's a real opportunity to persuade people this is an important issue.
Yeah, because data isn't a new thing. I mean, people have been looking at like graphs for years and years and years, but now obviously it's so much more accessible.
It is, and increasingly there's tooling that will let you take all of this huge amount of data and produce it in a form that management teams or citizens can make sense of. So I think that almost in any profession now, an understanding of data and how to present information is an
Mhm.
increasingly important part of your job, really.
Yeah. And where do you see kind of the future of data? Like, how deeply embedded do you see the use of data skills and things like that into people's everyday life?
So I think it'll increasingly, it's the university, for example, Newcastle University is increasingly talking about it being a fundamental part of every course. So irrespective of
Hmm.
what you're studying, I mean, we've done projects before with people working in poetry, tracking changes in drafts of poems over a long period of time and using data analytics to do that. So there's hardly any area where it doesn't play. I think what we need to see more of is pushing data skills into schools and data skills into schools as
Yeah.
well, because I think it's going to be a core skill for especially kids of today who are moving into jobs in 5 or 10 years. I think it's going to be absolutely core to their day-to-day existence.
Yeah. And what about with the centre? Can you tell us about, if they're not secret, how any big projects that are coming up over the next year or a couple of years?
So most of the projects we do aren't big projects. I think that's actually part of it.
Hmm.
Part of our plan is we do lots of small projects in order to excite people and get them interested. But I guess big themes is probably something that we could talk about. The big theme for me, and the one that I've been trying to pursuing for quite a few years now, is this interface between social care and healthcare. It always seems to
Okay.
me very strange, given the amount of money that we spend on all of these things, that there isn't more attention paid to making those services more integrated and more efficient. And the fact that the budgets tend to be completely separate and the services delivered tend to be reasonably separate. I think there's a
Mm.
huge opportunity there to improve services for citizens, but simultaneously save a lot of money from what are obviously very restricted budgets.
So, health and social care has the potential to obviously use it a lot more. Are there any industries that you think have absolutely nailed it and are using it to the maximum potential?
So financial services is the area where it's probably most extensively used at the moment, and that's because they can afford to pay the
Right.
salaries that bring the people in to do that. Yeah, the other areas where it's being used, the big platform vendors are actually using data analytics very effectively. So people like Amazon and Google and Microsoft and so on. And I think it's interesting that when I ask people in the commercial world who their biggest competitors are, they'll list the people you might expect. But then, irrespective if they're a retail car retailer or energy company or a supermarket, they'll include Amazon as one of their feared competitors. And the reason for that is they know that
Really?
Amazon has all this data that they've pulled together about customers. And if they turn their guns on their sector, then there would be a real danger of huge disruption.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting.
I think the only thing I'd like to add is around the importance of data to the organization. So, whether you're public
Hmm.
sector or private sector. So, I think that lots of organizations, because they don't understand the issues around data, their temptation is to outsource, to bring in a big vendor
Yeah.
to take the problem away. But this is not something they should be outsourcing because data is absolutely core to the organization. It's such an important part of what you do, and it's key to innovation. Most of the innovation that we're seeing
Mm.
today is digital, and much of that is in data. And so, outsourcing your data is the same thing as outsourcing your innovation. And if you do that, you're on
Yeah.
a path to stagnation. Yeah.
So your whole thing is kind of enabling them to do it themselves.
Yeah. The key thing is not just to have a bunch of technology and a black box into which you drop data and it produces results, but to have staff, employees who understand how to cut and slice data in different ways to get different outputs. And without those people on board, you can't fully understand your organization and you can't fully respond to change. because every time you have to go back to your vendor or your consultant and ask them to do the job for you. Whereas if you have them in-house, you're agile and you can respond quickly.
It all sounds really exciting. Is the centre open for visitors? Obviously not now, but in general?
So the centre is certainly open for visitors, and we're in this beautiful building that we have. We're trying to get as many people in the door as we can. I'd love to have a class of school kids in every day, being inspired by what we're doing with data. We've got some people at the moment working on a huge data wall that will show data in lots of different aspects. We have a beautiful decision theater that you can go into where you can actually talk about how you can use data in the organization. So we're trying to build an exciting ecosystem in the building and increasingly online. But we're certainly open for anybody who has any level of interest in data, whether they be school kids, citizens, or technical experts or executives.
I think I'm definitely going to have to pay you a visit when things go back to normal.
Please do. We also have a fantastic cafe that does wonderful cakes and teas. So something for everyone.
Sold. Thank you so much. And thank you for talking to me today. I've really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, Emily.
Join us on next week's show where we'll be speaking to Sir David Bell, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sunderland.